Hey, it's Liz. And I just wanted to talk about something that I've been thinking about for a while and something that came up in the comments recently for my last video. So I just kind of wanted to turn it into its own thing. And that is comparing and contrasting some of the behaviors of people on the autism spectrum versus narcissistic personality disorder. Now, I'm not a professional, I'm not a therapist, but I am very secure and confident in my self diagnosis on the autism spectrum, and I know a lot about it. And so I have that experience as well as, learning from the similar experiences of many other people who are on the spectrum. And when it comes to narcissistic personality disorder, I've just dealt with a bunch of people who were either diagnosed with it, at least in one case, uh, as well as several people who were not. And most people with NPD are not diagnosed because they don't think there's anything wrong with them. Uh, Conversely, a lot of women on the spectrum are not diagnosed because there's the diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum is geared toward the symptoms that tend to present more readily in males. So, whatever. Anyway, I've done a lot of reading about both of these disorders, conditions, uh, because of, having to heal from narcissistic abuse. It was really helpful for me to gain a greater understanding as to why they did the things that they did and what their behaviors were about. So let me just dig into it. So I think the confusion between the two mostly comes in when it comes to empathy and these discussions around empathy. And I think for starters, it's important to realize that, at least the way I think about it, empathy has two parts. There's the desire and intention to understand and relate to the people around you. And then there's the actual ability to. So basically, people on the autism spectrum have a harder time with their ability to. They have it's harder for us to just wrap our heads around what people are signaling, why people are reacting the way they're reacting, maybe to our behavior. Why things that we're doing might be considered rude. To maybe even for some of us understand our own emotions and the emotions of the people that we're around. And those other people may feel that they're communicating very clearly, but we may still not understand or might just be very oblivious to how we're affecting others. So that's on the ability area. That does not necessarily mean we don't care or that we don't want to understand. I think for me and for a lot of people, there's kind of this thing that happens at some point in your life where suddenly you become aware that people have been reacting to you or to the things that you're doing negatively. And you just were totally oblivious to it before. You just didn't realize what these interactions and dynamics were. You just didn't see it at all. And that was the case for me. I did not understand that I was putting people off or offending people by certain things. And by my general sort of presentation that like my personality and my way of interacting was like making a lot of people uncomfortable. That did not dawn on me much at like not really until my late teens. And that was because one person in my life in particular was very direct about communicating it to me where nobody else was. Everybody else seemed to, I think, just assume that I knew what I was doing, um, and understood how I was offending people and doing it anyway. And that was not the case. I did not understand. um, so then started the difficult work of trying to become more aware and trying to study human behavior and cultural behavior, to be more just to be more aware of the signals people were giving me and how I could sort of adjust so that I came off in a way that was, so that my intentions and what I wanted to communicate was coming through more clearly to other people. And there was kind of an intermediary time when I would just kind of was like, well, screw everyone who doesn't understand me, because I was just really frustrated that all of these that all of these standards that seemed really arbitrary to me were being placed on me. Like I just didn't. It seemed unfair, and I was a teenager, so I rebelled. And to be fair, there are still societal standards that I feel are too arbitrary for me to, capitulate to. Um, maybe that's immature of me. But mostly I came around about a lot of things anyway. So that's like very sort of common narrative for people on the spectrum. Just a second, I'm gonna close this door. Hopefully I don't get a copyright strike for that. So yeah, it's just like it's really difficult, and it requires a lot more conscious effort to like be tuned into people. I think I do it okay now, and I think I've actually developed a lot of skills that allow me to read people in situations. And now more often than not, when I talk to somebody and I'm like, okay, this was my impression, and they're like, yeah, that's spot on. That's exactly what was going on. Like, that's exactly the kind of person this is. Like I've worked hard to develop those skills, but it was a conscious effort in a way that I don't think it is for most people. Now, narcissists, on the other hand, their issue is not necessarily that they have a difficult time understanding what other people are feeling. They just don't care. So that means either they don't even bother to find out, or they do find out, they do know. Somebody might tell them, this is how I feel, blah, 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 and they don't care. So that's why they're being cold. That's why they're continuing to do the behavior that is hurtful to people. It's not an issue of not understanding or not being able to understand. So what I said in my comment for that other video is that from what I've noticed too, because narcissists, what they're trying to do, the reason that they have so little empathy, the reason that they don't care, is kind of a defense mechanism for them, because they really have very fragile egos. So for them, if they started caring about other people's feelings, that would be a huge challenge to their whole way of dealing with the world. The way they've sort of kept themselves emotionally safe through whatever trauma they've been through, because NPD is a trauma response from early life trauma. They've learned to keep themselves safe by not extending themselves empathically to others, because that does make you vulnerable in a way. So their brain has kind of decided to cut off that vulnerability. And when you're dealing with somebody who is hurting you all the time and you can't get away, it really doesn't pay to be empathetic towards them. That's not going to work well in the short term. The problem, of course, with somebody like this is that they're probably no longer in the situation that caused them to have the NPD, and they are making everyone else deal with these defense mechanisms that they have that are so just ingrained now in their personality and worldview. So yeah, so that's why they don't care, and they tend to do one of two things. Um, they're either just on the sort of extreme cold, callous end of the spectrum. Um, truly just be able to look you in your face and say, like, I don't care. I know that I did blank to you or to someone else. And who cares? Because, you're worthless, they're worthless. I was justified. It wasn't that bad, whatever. But a lot of narcissists aren't quite so bold. So a lot of them, I really believe, will delude themselves into believing that they didn't do the bad things. They would never do those things. Like, I really think a lot of them believe that when they say it. Like, they seem to me to be masters at manipulation, not just of other people, but of themselves, because they have to constantly be protecting their own ego and their own vision of themselves. And if they view themselves as somebody who's benevolent, as somebody who's good, as somebody who is loving and empathic, and there are narcissists who are self-styled empaths, then they have to make everything they do fit that narrative. And whether that means, sugarcoating it or remembering it differently or justifying it or even forgetting it selectively, they'll do that, whatever protects their narrative. So I've actually seen, and I talked about this in the video that I made on my Patreon that's very, very personal, and it has a lot of really personal details that I don't feel comfortable admitting without a paywall. Not admitting in terms of like, well, I don't know, it's a lot. But one of the things that I will totally tell you about is that this abuser, because I'm sure he doesn't, remember this, right? But this abuser at one point, he had this whole romantic narrative about our relationship. And at one point, just in a moment of being tired of playing the part that he wanted me to play all the time and going along with whatever, I just flat out told him, like, no, like, that narrative's incorrect. Actually, I always felt coerced by you. I was never attracted to you. It was never good for me. This is, I do not feel passionately. This is not, none of the things that you said are true. And I will never forget the way he looked back at me with this look like he was just leaving his body, just gaping mouth, just like, his eyes, I swear his eyes started to kind of roll back in his head, and then suddenly he snapped out of it and he just started talking about something else, like we'd never had the conversation. And I know that he forgot because he brought up the same tired romance narrative about us, after that. As though we'd never had the conversation. He just chose to not hear me. It's like it went right from one ear to the other, just like out. It was wild. And I think that's what had been happening all along. Like, I really think he genuinely believed that I was, passionately, into him, and that we had this great thing. because it's not as though I was even pretending that that was the case. Our relationship was I did what I had to do, or what I felt like I had to do, because of his coercion. um it was not joyful, you know um but he saw what he wanted to see, I think. And that's yeah. So that's narcissists. And the thing about narcissists too, that make a big difference between narcissists and ASD. And like, by the way, I think it's probably possible to have both. I'm not 100% because I know part of what allows narcissistic personality disorder to develop, it's not just trauma, it's also kind of the right genetics and the right brain type. So I don't know if those things are mutually exclusive or not. But that aside, I think one of the big differences in my experience is that people with NPD tend to be very good at being charming when they want to be. They can come off all kinds of different ways. Usually, they're very good at social manipulation, and people on the autism spectrum are not. I think we can learn how to be more chameleons in different spaces and how to kind of mimic other people. But what we can't do is just sort of turn on the charm. We're not good at invoking sort of different states of being in other people, which is something that narcissists are great at. That's why they become like cult leaders, because that's a lot of what reels people in, is that they can induce these feelings in other people if they have that kind of charisma generally. Um, and I think, some narcissists might sort of choose to go the route of being very cold, um, in order to woo kind of maybe a different kind of person. But most of the narcissists that I have directly or indirectly sort of known, uh, like to present themselves as being maybe smarter than other people, and maybe like that makes it okay for them to be mean to certain people, but they still want to present themselves as basically good, and even as wise or spiritual, that kind of thing. So so they're very good at that kind of high level social manipulation that someone on the autism spectrum is unlikely to ever be able to engage in social manipulation at that level. Like, we're kind of lucky if we can just sort of be likable and blend in, you know, basically. Um, so yeah, and also another dynamic I feel like needs to be said here, if we're going to be talking about both of these groups, is that people on the autism spectrum are especially good targets for narcissists, because especially when we're young, but in general, because we tend to have, in some ways, a more naive view of people. I think all of us tend to assume that more or less other people are basically like us, and that whatever it is they're doing might be different from what we're doing, but whatever they're doing it for the reasons that we would do it if we were going to do it. Right? Like, we tend to analyze people's intentions and motivations and and emotions based on how we would do those things, how we would signal those things, why would be doing those things. And the thing is, that's just not, there's so many different kinds of people in the world. It's a hard lesson to learn. I see this too with narcissists. They'll tend to sort of naively, I guess, or maybe cynically assume that other people are doing the things they're doing for the reasons that they would. So, for instance, I had an interaction with one of these narcissists where he made me cry at a party. We were very sleep deprived. He said some really hurtful things to me and I cried. And his assumption, just baseline assumption, was that I must be crying to get attention and start drama. That must be why I'm crying, not because I was hurt, not because I actually couldn't help it. Um, and that was so telling to me. It was such an interesting projection. Um, but for people on the autism spectrum, I think we tend to assume that, yeah, it's hard for us to understand how someone would be manipulative, because to us it seems extremely difficult, to the point that, morality aside, I know for me, the kind of levels of mind games and manipulation that I've seen some people play, truly cannot fathom why they would do it, because it seems, from my perspective, to be such an exhausting pursuit that it does not seem worth whatever they're getting out of it. It just seems really insane to me that they would spend their time doing. It stresses me out so much, even to tell small lies to people. And that's not to say I never ever lie. I certainly do, especially to sort of keep from hurting people and that kind of thing. Smooth over some rough edges, or not go into all of the detailed nuances about every single thing in a conversation. But when it comes to those bigger lies where, you're really trying to manipulate people and you're really trying to play this whole kind of power game, I can't fathom living like that. It just seems crazy. But I've had to reconcile the fact that some people do. And that for some people, the payoff at least feels worth it to them at the time. Um, Even though personally, I just can't relate. So that's given me, when I was younger, a lot more. I give a lot of benefit of the doubt to people, because it just seemed so unrealistic to me that they would be playing all these great games. So yeah, we definitely do become targets for narcissists because of our naivete about that kind of thing. I guess I'll just end it here. But if you have any more thoughts about this, or any other reasons you think these two groups of people get confused, please tell me in the comments, because I'm really curious about this, because I think as internal experiences, generally speaking, we just couldn't be much more different. And I also wonder if anybody knows if these two conditions are mutually exclusive. I kind of feel like they're not, just because there's one person in particular that I didn't know that well, and he was on the autism spectrum, but I did kind of get the sense that he was self-involved and unempathic in a way that was beyond just an issue of ability. To me, it seemed like maybe he also didn't really care and also kind of glorified himself. So I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. But anyway, let me know. Bye.